All right, so here in chapter 12, we're going to talk about superstition, which is kind of a fun topic to talk about. And we'll talk about the role that critical thinking has in believing in superstition and the way that we can use objective thinking in order to identify the pros and cons of superstition. We're not just going to universally lambaste superstition because it can be useful, but we need to think about it from a very critical standpoint and know when we're using superstition as a way to innocently, maybe that's not the right word, but I'll use it anyways, innocently increase performance and make decisions versus when it's not a good idea to do it. So here are some learning outcomes that we're going to look at in this chapter. We're going to identify sources and examples of superstition. We are going to look at magical thinking. We are going to explain how these thinking and judgment errors can make superstition and magical thinking seem more reasonable. And then we're going to talk about how to deal effectively with superstition and magical thinking. Again, it's interesting in that we always talk about these non-critical thinking things as things we ought to avoid. Superstition has its place, so we'll look at that as well. So, what do you think? And we will start with, just as a riddle, obviously. You can read the answer in the book, but that's fine. What do President Herbert Hoover, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and presidential candidate John McCain have in common in terms of their specific beliefs? This is outdated. John McCain is now dead, so he's not a candidate. So what do they have in terms of their specific beliefs? Well, it is the number 13. They all find that the number 13 is unlucky and have done certain things to avoid the number 13. Cited that John McCain carried 31 cents in his pocket as a way to counteract 13 because 31 is 13 backwards. And when his party had a convention, it was on the 13th floor. So instead of calling it the 13th floor, he relabeled it the M floor. For McCain as a way to get around using the number 13. Okay. So something to think about is, would you vote for somebody who you knew to be superstitious? Why or why not? All right. So just think about that. And as we go through this chapter, be thinking about that kind of ideas. You know, what kind of person is superstitious? Are they trustworthy? Would you want them representing you? Okay. Some more things to think about. Do you have a lucky shirt or some other lucky object that brings you luck? All right. How does something become lucky? Curiously, we have lucky things, but how did they become lucky in the first place? All right. When things are going great, are you careful of what you do next so you don't tempt fate or push your luck? Are superstition and magical thinking common? So do you see them around? Do you see them around different contexts across different people? Are they less common now than in earlier times? And if they are, why do you think that might be? So we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the psychological history of superstition. And then, should we try to eliminate superstition and magical thinking? Why or why not? I've alluded to the idea that maybe it can be useful, but we have to have a specific context for it. Okay. All right, so let's jump right into superstition, false beliefs, and poor judgment. So what is a superstition? Okay, so there are lots of different definitions for superstition. I like the behavioral definition, which is leading back to the pigeon experiments where, using operant conditioning, you could train a pigeon to peck a bar and get a piece of food, and they would do that as a way to get something as a result of something that they did. So just straight operant conditioning. You could also train them to be superstitious by selectively reinforcing them with food every time they push the bar, but after they do something that's not related to pushing the bar, like spinning in a circle, for example. So we can train pigeons to be superstitious. What it looks like is that they have some kind of belief about the world that's related to some other area of functioning, like getting food, but it's actually not related to it at all. All right, so the working definition we can use here in a vaguer, more broadcast way is that a superstition is a type of common sense belief that's not plausible and it's false. Right, and maybe there's a small asterisk there because sometimes we can perform better because we have some kind of good luck charm, for example. Maybe it gives us confidence or something. So the link between that superstitious idea and performance isn't exactly false, but the direct connection between the object and performance or the outcome is definitely false. We have to bridge the gap there mentally. All right. So superstition is usually a ritualistic action, something that you do each time the circumstance warrants it. So maybe if you're going on a long road trip, maybe you put something on your dashboard that will keep you safe or something like that. Or maybe if you want to have good luck, you'll do something a certain way. Maybe you're going to the casino or something like that. You'll do something a certain way. Athletes are usually very superstitious. They do things a certain way, maybe before an at bat if you're a baseball or softball player, or maybe you wear a certain pair of socks so that you can, run faster or whatever. What usually happens with these is that they can increase your performance a little bit because maybe you're a little bit more confident, but the link between those objects and performance is not there. It's false. It's not plausible. It doesn't actually increase the probability. What increases the probability is your response to the superstition. All right. So how does this relate to pseudoscience? Well, you have superstition, which is an idea or a supposed link that seems scientific but isn't. A misconception is a belief that you have about something that is not based on some kind of reality or is based on faulty thinking. And then pseudoscience is the idea that something kind of looks scientific but it's actually not. All right, so all three of those ideas make unsubstantiated claims. We can't really measure them in a reliable way or a valid way. Superstition looks like a pseudoscientific belief because they're both implausible based on what we know from science. So the superstition does not match up with it matches up with pseudoscience because neither one of them can make strict scientific claims, although things might appear to make scientific claims or might appear to trend together in a measurable way. Okay. However, usually people who believe in pseudoscience are people who think that there is an actual connection between whatever they're observing and the scientific process. But people who are superstitious oftentimes recognize and realize that what they believe in is not scientific, that is just luck, and that people generally qualify luck as a non-scientific thing, as just a belief that they might have. Okay. So let's jump into the history of superstition then. So superstition and magic kind of go hand in hand. And what's interesting is that magic has been around a very long time. And we're talking about, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. And it's this belief in some kind of phenomenon that's inexplicable. We don't know what causes it. We don't know where it comes from. So sometimes it's ritual, sometimes it's a potion, it's a practice, but it's some kind of thing that we engage in that might be able to control nature. Now, I know that when we think about magic in the 21st century, we might be thinking about like doing magic tricks and things like that. But we're also talking about beliefs that people had that might be able to control the world, such as maybe casting bones or something like that if you're into a Caribbean religion, or maybe using voodoo or something like that. There are lots of magical practices that people have that are impossible and don't actually have some kind of connection to the real world. What happens from time to time is that there is a coincidence that somebody does something one time, like drinking some kind of weird thing, and it seems to make a difference in their lives somehow. Usually what that means is that there is a coincidence there. But there are reasons why superstitions persist over time. And one of the ones that we can look at is witchcraft. And witchcraft is an interesting thing because there's the Wicca religion, which is a practice that's based on ideas surrounding witchcraft, but it's really an earth-based practice, and it's about a connection to the world and the phenomena that happen in nature and connecting them to into a belief system, right? So there's kind of this idea. There's also this witchcraft, this kind of vilified, sensationalized version of it, which is really people using some kind of spiritual or some kind of other force in order to control nature or people or something. So it's been found in the Hebrew Bible, right? The Torah. It's been found in the New Testament of the Bible. It was even in popular epics like the Odyssey. So this was written by Homer. 3,000 years ago now. Boy, that's a long time ago. But witchcraft it has been around a long time, and what we know about things that have been around a long time, they kind of take root in tradition. So if something's been around a long time, it's likely to persist just because it's been around a long time, and it becomes the basis for how people see the world. Okay. The Spanish Inquisition in Europe, I shouldn't just say the Spanish Inquisition, it was more than that, but people just think of the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, fine. But during the Inquisition, a lot of people were accused of witchcraft, and this was a way to kind of get rid of any force that would be seen at that point as anti-Catholic or anti-Christian. And it was a way to weed out competition among people who were followers of Catholicism. Okay. So people who are seen linked to witchcraft in any tenuous way would be convicted of it, and then they would be dealt with according to the church, which is usually not very pleasant, usually death. We even have a belief in witches in that sense, in that kind of like devious sense, even in the 21st century, even though we have information that does not support the idea of being able to control people with certain potions or with certain ideas, or witches being able to fly or control nature and things like that. That's not exactly what we have been found to be true from a scientific perspective, but we know that belief perseverance is a real thing, so superstition certainly does persist. Okay. So something that happens in the last 300 or 400 years is that science becomes more and more known in terms of being observable and empirical, and we're starting to be able to explain earlier phenomena. So we'll talk about the contagion effect, and it's a very interesting thing, and how people kind of sensed contagion before you could observe it. So there was a misconception about what contagion was. But what happens in the 16th to the 19th centuries, so we're talking about the 1500s through the 1800s or so, is that science could explain what we thought was supernatural, right? People thought that, these people cause disease. Well, no, people don't cause disease. Germs cause disease. And what happens is that people can transmit them. But what was going on prior to scientific understanding was that people were blaming other people for making them sick, as opposed to the transmission of these little things that we couldn't see called germs. Okay? So once we had microscopes available, we could say, oh, wait a second, this thing is what's making us sick, not the people themselves, although people do transmit disease. Okay, so there was enlightenment and a scientific revolution coming off of the Dark Ages, and more scientific-minded people were allowed to be free to speak their minds without being ostracized, which was a problem during the Dark Ages. Right? People who were scientifically minded were not able to speak because there was this huge urge to revert back to religious perspectives only, and then people who had scientific ideas were usually seen as people who believed in the supernatural or who were anti-God or whatever it was. So now you could have people challenging folk belief systems that were seen as unscientific or pseudoscientific. They were challenged, and there was an ability for people to engage in a thought process that increased a knowledge base that was more in line with what we recognize as more scientific truth. Now, when there is still this persistence of superstition, and usually it's because there's something called the law of similarity, which was also like the representativeness heuristic that we looked at in chapter 11. But the law of similarity is that if two things appear to go together, then they must be connected. Voodoo religion practices like voodoo dolls. You probably heard of voodoo dolls long before you knew anything about the voodoo religion, because there's kind of the sensationalized things about voodoo religion. And and using voodoo dolls to hurt people by poking them with needles and stuff. So people thought that, well, if I make a doll that looks like somebody and I have this kind of tenuous belief in being able to inflict pain on somebody using some kind of, they wouldn't call it this, but some kind of telekinesis, then I will be able to do it using this doll that looks like the person. Okay. So you have that kind of idea where like goes with like. So if something looks like something else, then it must be that thing. Okay. Which leads to the law of contagion. So what's interesting about the law of contagion is that people learned about contagion before they even knew that bugs or germs were causing people to be to be sick. So what was interesting was that people would naturally stay away from sick people because they didn't want to get sick like them. But what they thought was that there was some kind of either spirit or other kind of unknown, intangible source that would get them sick. So they would naturally stay away. So people knew that people were contagious, but they didn't know why. And it wasn't, again, until we're able to observe that there are germs and microbes and viruses and things like that that could get you sick. So the law of contagion didn't just apply then to things that we could observe empirically, well, especially now in the 21st century. It applied to anything. So if somebody were evil, they wouldn't want to touch something that they had touched, right? So something would be like hexed or jinxed or something like that. And there was this sense that you could pass on some kind of personality characteristic or emotion or negativity or positivity, I guess, we don't have to only focus on the negative stuff, but people could avoid somebody's piece of property and not be susceptible to the same evil that other person had. Or if somebody had let's say, a charm that made them perform well on something or brought them good luck, if somebody would also have that charm, then they themselves would be able to have good luck. So they recognized that there was a contagion about things because they thought that, if the law of similarity persists, if that person had good luck with this thing, then I'll have good luck with that thing too. Or a similar thing, maybe they make their own good luck charm, whatever it is. The idea of the law of contagion and the law of similarity going together is really encapsulated by that simple example, that if I have a thing like they have, then it'll bring me the same good luck that they had. In some cases, like in the case of good or bad luck, then the connection between those is faulty. But in terms of something like a disease, yes, it's not faulty because there is an actual physical contagion that we can recognize. And if somebody looks like they have a disease, we tend to stay away from them. So that's a reasonable a law of similarity application and a law of contagion. If somebody looks like they have, pink eye, and we can get pink eye by coming into contact with them, then we avoid that, and that's reasonable. But not when it comes to thinking about things like luck or superstition. Okay. So let's get into a bit more about how we actually believe superstition, so the psychology of it. All right, so a goal of critical thinking is trying to scientifically understand mental processes and behavior in observable and empirical ways. That's not to say that there are things that we don't or can't explain right now, because the unconscious mind is very tricky and things like that. But that's our goal, is to scientifically understand the mind, just like we try to scientifically understand the natural world. If the natural world is all the things that we observe and we observe each other, then we ought to try to observe ourselves scientifically as much as we can. Now, we have to also think about then which factors are contributing to superstitious beliefs, thinking, and behavior in terms of psychology and our understanding of it. So an example that we see from the book is the example of a baseball player, Wade Boggs. You can read through this and see all the things that he did as a way to take control of his performance. He didn't use superstition or luck as a crutch necessarily, but he used them as a way to take away the chance factors that are involved in his performance. So he didn't want to leave anything up to chance. So you can read through this and see the things that he had done. Okay. So we looked at this example last chapter a little bit, kind of teasing the notion of probability and likelihood. But this also bleeds into the common sense or folk belief about things, So even though we kind of know the answer already, what is the chance of two people in a group of 30 having the same birthday? And then the second question is, how might probability estimation be related to belief in superstition? Well, if you want to know the answer to this, you can take a look at the link. This link is available in the PowerPoint presentation in the same module as this lecture video. So you can take a look at that and look at a video from a YouTube channel that does a really good job of explaining how this works. What really happens when we think about common sense belief and superstition is that we oftentimes have some kind of coincidence factor that's built into our brains. We kind of have this unspoken thing that says, what's the likelihood that this thing will happen or that these two things happen together? And what usually happens is that we underestimate how likely two things are to coincide. So when two things do happen together, we think that it's this kind of miraculous thing, when in reality, two things coinciding is usually more likely to happen than we think. Just like the example of what's the likelihood of two people having the same birthday in a group of 30, it's about 70%. But most people would estimate it much, much less than that. So what you would think then is that, oh, wow, this is a really odd thing that happened, that two people in a room of 30 have the same birthday, when in reality it's actually not that odd. It's more likely to happen than not. But we oftentimes will think that coincidences are unlikely and therefore treat them as this kind of supernatural or peculiar thing. So what usually happens with superstition is that the associations that we have are underestimations based on our part, and that makes them seem a lot more fantastical. Okay. So if you have those coincidental events happening, then it kind of leads to the superstition that things are related to each other but really aren't. So these coincidental events will happen, but usually at lower frequencies. I think one of the more interesting sets of coincidences that are out there, and you can Google this on your own. I didn't include this in the resources, but there are lots of good resources that will outline the coincidences behind the JFK presidency and Abraham Lincoln's presidency. A lot of cool, interesting things. Okay. Usually what happens with coincidences too is that because people like to make patterns, that's that gestalt sense that we all have to make things whole. Because we have that, we will strive to put coincidences together or to make patterns out of them as if they are related but aren't. And usually if we take two things that aren't related and put them together, it seems like it's odd that they go together because, well, it is. But if we try to make it so that those two things go together and that they should go together and that there's an actual connection, then it seems peculiar or unlikely to happen, which kind of jacks up the sense that we're going to attribute it to superstition. A lot of people also will think that coincidences are based in the paranormal or supernatural, especially when they happen to them, because if it happens to them, then they have this sense of naive realism that we've talked about before, where people think that, oh, I see the world as it actually is, and if something odd like that happens, then there must be something, some kind of truth to that event happening. I had a patient, I may have shared this with you already, I had a patient in psychotherapy who said that she knew what the lottery numbers were and that she should have played them. And she said that, I swear that I wrote these numbers down and I should have played these lottery numbers because that's what they actually were. Well, she couldn't find where she wrote them down. She couldn't remember what the numbers were, but in her mind she believed that she had the answers, so the correct numbers. So the coincidence there is that she had this long shot guess as to what the lottery numbers were going to be, and that they matched what the lottery numbers were. Now, did she probably have those numbers? No, she didn't. And she said that it's happened on several other occasions where she has guessed that. Well, she thought that maybe there was kind of supernatural connection that she had to numbers, and that she sensed how numbers were going to work, especially lottery numbers. Well, unfortunately, she was never able to make that prediction come to pass, so we didn't cash out on that. But she had the superstition then that if she started writing things down on napkins, then things were more likely to happen if she put them down on napkins, because that's how she would always write down her lottery numbers that she was going to guess. Now, just because we've kind of labeled superstition as not scientific, that doesn't mean that it's not helpful. Certainly, superstition can help people cope with different life events. They can give people more confidence to do things that they otherwise might not do. There's lots of different ways superstition can be helpful. So usually when people are engaging in some of these risky or high stakes activities, the superstition can help them. So like I said, it gives them confidence. It helps keep them focused. So imagine like a fighter pilot who is able to focus just because they have this superstitious belief in a knick-knack they have with them or something like that, right? It's important that if a fighter pilot is able to focus, then they can perform better. That's a good thing for them to be able to do. And if all it takes is some kind of superstitious thing, that's perfectly fine. We talked about the Wade Boggs example and the John McCain example. These are all fine things for them to have. They're not hurtful. They don't lead them into some kind of mistaken belief about the world. It doesn't lead them to do anything dangerous. So these are all reasonable things, and to help them to be able to cope is very reasonable in that situation. All right, so we talked a little bit about this in terms of, I'm drawing a blank. Hello. Operant conditioning. So kind of maybe a little bit of overlap here, just because we'll talk about stimulus reinforcement and everything. But according to learning theory, when a behavior is reinforced, like in operant conditioning, people are likely to engage in that behavior. So if you do a superstitious thing once or twice or maybe 3 times, and you recognize some kind of trend, then you're reinforced by that trend, like wearing the same socks while you're competing in something or whatever. Then you're likely to do it because you are reinforced for the things that you do. So you learn to do things based on the reinforcement. So you may not change something, even though it wasn't related to performance, for example. So there are lots of examples of that. I'll let you to looking those examples in the book if you'd like to. I'm not going to have to harp on those right now. But the learning theory, which is where we get the behavioral modification technique of operant conditioning from. The learning theory is a great place to understand, kind of like almost from a structural standpoint, what superstition is. It kind of takes away the mysticism of it being like this kind of like this belief in something and this paranormal and everything. Really what it is from a learning theory standpoint is just you got reinforced somehow. Something good happened as a result of this coincidence that you had, this unrelated thing. So now you assume that it's going to be the same each time, and it develops into a superstition. Now, as far as superstition goes with objects, people oftentimes think of an object as this prerequisite for some kind of outcome, like performance or something like that. They will see it as the key to success, especially in risky activities, or activities where you're being tested on some kind of outcome that carries a lot of weight, like taking a test. So the object is kind of like this unrelated third aspect in terms of like something. Let's say taking a test. That's the kind of the example on this slide. If you're taking a test and you study well, and you do well on the test, you might think, oh, I did well on this test, and look, I was using this pen I've never used before, so I'm going to try to use this pen again. And let's say that you study for the test and you do well on the test again, and then you use the same pen. Okay, great. Now you're thinking, oh, this is a lucky pen. The reality is that that pen is just a pen, and the real part of you doing well was related to your studying. But we think that it was the pen. It's a third variable in this equation, and it's not really related to your performance. I mean, you could think of like this magical way that it's related, like maybe, oh, I like the way that it felt and it didn't distract me. I was able to concentrate on the test better. Okay, fine, but that's real sensory input. We're not talking about superstition at that point. We're talking about something that doesn't distract you. But if the pen is just a pen, the same as any other pen, but it just happens to be the pen that you used when you were taking the test and you did well on it, then it becomes superstitious, right? We do this with lots of other objects too. As a matter of fact, there aren't many objects that people have that are related to superstition that serve any other function except for the superstition itself. So it's not like people use, like my pen is superstitious to me, but also because, it has answers written on it or whatever, whatever fanciful thing might happen. It doesn't actually impact your ability to take the test in any measurable way, except for that you'd have this psychological belief in the fact that it's going to help you perform better. So usually what happens in terms of thinking errors and superstition is that there is a post hoc ergo propter hoc effect, or that, remember, that's the effect that says that after something happened, I can attribute it because of something else, right? So just like the pen example, if you go through the test and you do well on it, you can, after the fact, go back and look and see what you did and then attribute that to your success. But beforehand, you would have never thought, oh, this pen is going to make me perform better. Usually what people would say is, oh, well, I studied and I'm prepared for the test, so I'm going to do well on it. So the pen, before you take the test, would have no impact on whether or not you thought you're going to do well in the test or not. But after the fact, you look back on it, and that's where it becomes superstitious, because you look back on it, and the thinking error is, because I did well on it, it must be because of something else. Okay, you can read through the example, and you can look at those in the book as well if you'd like to. But when we connected it to the pen example, that was good enough for this. The law of contagion also is linked to superstitious objects. There are lots of weird examples. The one from the book's quite weird, where John Lennon's molar was bought as a superstitious thing because people thought that there was some kind of essence of him in his tooth, or he had the superstitious belief. They may not have thought it like from an objective standpoint, but they had the superstitious belief that there was something going on with that tooth, and it would somehow bring them good luck. Or that, if somebody caught a foul ball at a ball game and it was from a good hitter, that maybe if they used that ball, at the sandlot back home playing ball, then they would be able to hit a home run or whatever it is. The law of contagion persists to superstitious objects, where if you have maybe a superstitious object that you use when you drive to keep you safe, you give it to somebody else because it has good luck, then the law of contagion might say that somebody believes that because the luck travels with the item. So the association with the entity persists even over time. So here's John Lennon's weird-looking, decaying tooth, right? You figure with all that money you could get a tooth fixed, but whatever. Some people don't like to go to the dentist. I don't know. But this is an example of how somebody bought it because it was associated with the celebrity, even though it's just a gross old tooth. So here's a question for you, just kind of a rhetorical question, maybe answer on your own. Would you wear the sweater of a convicted killer? Okay. Would it creep you out? Furthermore, would you buy a house where somebody was murdered? Right. That's kind of a kind of another one where people are worried about the law of contagion. So even though we might not think that it's sensible to avoid or be attracted to objects based on whatever the contagion is, we do it unconsciously. So when you make a decision based on something that's not rational, it might be superstitious when it has to do with this contagion effect. Okay. So here's a real world negative consequences law of contagion, is that for people who have terminal diseases that have a high death rate, something like AIDS, people will avoid them even though the way that you actually contract AIDS is through bodily fluids, and not all of them, by the way. Blood primarily, but we also know that there are other ways to contract AIDS. But people will avoid them because they're worried about contracting AIDS, even though it's not easily transmitted except for those bodily fluids. So, just touching somebody is not enough to get AIDS. So people get shunned because they have superstitious beliefs or unscientific beliefs about the nature of disease transmission with regard to AIDS. Okay. So here's another stop and think. So a high school student, John, is waiting to hear if he was accepted to Stanford University. His mother bought him a Stanford t-shirt. Is John tempting fate by wearing the t-shirt before he gets his acceptance letter? Right? So is he jinxing himself? Maybe you've been in a situation like this. Okay. So two groups were asked this question in a bit of research. One group was told that John would wear the t-shirt right away. The other was told that he would wait to wear it. All the participants rated how likely it was that Stanford would accept John for his admittance. Right? So what they found was that among this research sample, the group was told that John would wear the shirt right away, rated him as being less likely to get accepted, so that he would, in other words, saying that he jinxed himself by wearing it early. We know that there isn't a connection there. Okay? So apparent mental causation, right? So believing that merely having a thought without the intervention of behavior or physical factor can affect another person or influence an event. Okay, so apparent mental causation, just by having this shirt on, right? Just by thinking about wearing a shirt, right? Is a mental fallacy that we have about superstition and mental causation causing things. Okay. An example of this from research is that participants in a study who were instructed to form positive visualizations of a peer's successful basketball shooting believed that they had influenced a peer. Okay, so people thought that if I had good thoughts, then somebody would do well. Okay, conversely, they've also found that people who thought negative about other people would cause somebody to have some kind of negative consequence or negative outcome. So apparent mental causation is a paranormal belief, thinking that by thinking something, you can cause something in the physical world to happen just by thinking it. That's the same thing as telepathy or telekinesis. So telepathy is being able to influence a mind or to be able to read a mind at a distance, and telekinesis is being able to control an object or some kind of physical thing in the world. So apparent mental causation is no different than that. Just by having a thought does not influence outcomes. So why do superstition and magical thinking persist? Well, we already talked about the law of contagion, that there's an evolutionary bias for it, right? So this idea that we avoid people who look a certain way because there's a contagion effect has its roots way back before, again, we measured some kind of contagious germ or bug. We couldn't measure that. But people learned to stay away from people, but they didn't know why. So it was this, again, this kind of like this method of staying safe that to people in ancient civilizations was unconscious, but it just became the way that they did things. And what they would end up doing is pairing these unreasonable signals that somebody was ill with some kind of real sense that people were ill, and these invalid cues that they developed were starting to rule the day instead of using these logical ways or scientific ways, which to their credit they didn't know about, so it's not like we can blame them for it necessarily, but they would start to link other things to it. Okay, so are people using magical thinking? So here's an example of how the law of contagion was this mystical thing. So during the Black Plague epidemic in the 1300s, people moved away from people who were ill to reduce contact. Okay, so they didn't know why contact made them sick. They didn't know about germs and bugs back then. Okay, all they knew was that they needed to create distance. So are the people in these examples showing a kind of magical thinking? And if so, what? Okay, why might they want to distance themselves even though germ theory would not be discovered for centuries? Okay, so obviously this is the law of contagion. Okay? People were responding to sick individuals by isolating themselves even though they didn't know why. It was a good reason that they did it. It was superstitious to them, but it was actually rooted in reality, which is kind of an interesting thought. How many things do we have superstitious belief in now that does have a scientific reason behind it? We're just not aware of it yet. Interesting. We can't possibly think that we know everything now, right? So that stands to reason that we might learn something in the future that has a scientific root that we don't know about now. Okay. So we have the law of contagion. Another alternative explanation raises the question of whether Hippocrates himself first intuited the idea that people should avoid sick people. Because Hippocrates said, we need to avoid people who are sick. Didn't know why, but we should do it. So superstition, magical thinking persists because historically contagion effect was what was used. It becomes traditional. They just did it because they knew that it would keep them well, but they didn't always know the scientific reason behind it. All right, so what this also leads to, is a sense that there's a higher rate of obsessive-compulsive disorder in superstitious people. So there are individual differences in these superstitious beliefs, right? So there is this connection between obsessive-compulsive disorder, for example, and superstition, right? So superstition generally is not associated with a psychological disorder, but for people who insist on turning the lights on and off 3 times, let's say, to go in and out of a room, or need something to feel a certain way, like their socks need to feel a certain way or whatever, they can obsess about it and they can have compulsions about it. But these are highly individualized among people. There are some superstitions that are more common than others, and that's fine, but generally the superstition that people have is related to just their understanding of it, not based on a global understanding of it necessarily. Okay? Another reason why we think that superstitious beliefs are individual is because it enacts type 1 thinking, this fast, knee-jerk, experiential type belief system. And because they don't use critical thinking, people who believe in superstition, they don't use critical thinking generally about the objective nature of their superstition. We believe it to be type 1 experiential. And if it's experiential, then it's experiential for that person. Yes, people do share experiences, that's true. But generally the way that people internalize and integrate experiences into their personal psychology is individual. So superstitious beliefs do tend to be individual, even if people have similar tokens of the superstition or whatever. All right, so last thing we'll cover is how do we deal with superstition and magical thinking. Okay. So sometimes not well, by the way. So if you have superstition and it's completely unrelated to science, that can be problematic. So one of the things that still persists as late as the early 2000s was witchcraft being practiced in Africa and using chickens as sacrificial animals to indicate whether or not somebody has somebody is experiencing witchcraft or somebody is a witch. And people will oftentimes use these superstitious or ritualistic ways of healing as opposed to going to a medical professional. So people, for example, who have AIDS have oftentimes gone outside of conventional medicine to find results, even though those results have not been scientifically studied and merited based on what evidence they have found to support it. Okay. So do we need to get rid of superstition altogether? Not exactly. Okay, you can increase performance based on expectation using some kind of superstitious object or some kind of luck token. People who had an expectation or luck were more successful on a memory task than those who were not. What we also find in that same study is that the people who believed that they had a good luck charm were focusing for longer periods of time on a task, suggesting that there was some kind of expectancy effect, meaning that they expected to succeed, so they persisted longer. So what that really suggests is that maybe it wasn't the luck itself, but the persistence because of the luck charm. So you can use luck charms as a way to bolster your persistence, but it's the persistence that's going to pay off, not the good luck charm. Again, that superstitious idea is that third variable that helps you, and we ought to realize that that's the case. Rather than just suggesting that it's the good luck charm that caused the outcome, caused the better performance. So we have to realize that that luck and superstition is a third variable and not something that we can use as a resultant effect or as some kind of causative outcome. Okay. So obviously superstition is a problem, so what we do need to deal with superstition when it is problematic. So when it harms a superstitious person, or if it causes ostracization or some kind of other negative effect, we have to definitely reject our use of superstition. And we have to be aware of superstition from a metacognitive standpoint, so being aware of the objective nature of superstition and of science, and recognizing that we have to use superstition very carefully in a methodical and controlled way, and not just in this kind of aloof spiritual mystic way. All right, so that's all for superstition and belief. When we talk about critical thinking, make sure that you're paying attention to superstition. And again, I'm not asking you to just get rid of all superstitious behavior, because like we've talked about, they can be helpful for performance, but we need to make sure that we're rooting our superstition in some kind of a safe way, and in a way that does not perpetuate negativity or traditions that are not scientific, especially when you're purporting to have some kind of scientific outcome as a result of it. All right, so that's all for Chapter 12. We'll see you next time.